Good morning. You're listening to Central Wisconsin's 24-hour information station, AM 1320 WFHR. It's time now for the Morning Magazine, brought to you by Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing.
Welcome, everyone, to Morning Magazine for this March 12th, 2021. Your host, James J. Malouf here. In part two today, we're going to speak with Nakusa Mayor Dan Carlson, also be joined by Rick Schmidt and Director Howard Freeman, when we're going to talk about Nakusa Walleye Days. Looking forward to that. Right now, we have in with us Wisconsin Rapids Public Schools Superintendent Craig Broeren. Good morning, Craig.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. Also want to thank our great friends over at Wisconsin Rapids Community Media, Kevin, the gang over there. We appreciate you guys being here. Always fun to have you guys in studio with us. Craig, before we get going here, how are you and yours doing? How's everybody holding up?
We're doing well. Keeping on. You know, I mean, it's been a very unique and difficult year, but we're in a good spot. And I think we're going to end the year on a positive note and, you know, go back at it again next.
Good to hear. And you do. I feel like you just worded it exactly how all of us would word it right now. So, yeah, that's good to hear. We certainly want to take our time and get into the referendum. Before we do that, though, we have some exciting news for our students out there and everything, considering what's starting next week.
Absolutely. Yeah. So next week, the week of March 15th, marks our kids at Rams and Lincoln, the majority of our secondary level students, going back to 4 days in-person learning. And so their first day will be Tuesday, the 16th, because Monday will be our offsite or virtual day. And in my communication just from yesterday to parents, the rationale behind Mondays is really just to provide us an opportunity to account for and take care of contact tracing of any positives that come in on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You know, be proactive as possible so that we can do outreach and ensure that if there are positives that they're notified and they don't show up at school. But students will attend Tuesday through Friday, effective next week. We're going to do that for a few weeks. And then if the data is advantageous, based on what we're seeing as far as positive cases is concerned, because the case rate in the district and through the community has been very, very low. So it's a great time to give it a shot. But if the case rates stay low and we're not seeing any significant, increases or changes, we'll move to 5 days per week to finish the school year at some point and set us up fairly well to begin next school year, because it does sound like we'll still be dealing at least with portions of what we're dealing with now to enter in the next school year. Yeah.
I can't help but think, too, not to look at this in a cold way or as numbers or anything like that. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but it doesn't hurt to have some data coming out of this year looking at next year and not knowing what's around the corner, to be honest. So
yeah, and with one of the aspects that we implemented, which albeit is not, absolute necessity, but one thing that our board, in consultation with our medical advisors, implemented was surveillance testing. And that is basically by the way, it's with consent only. So we are not just randomly grabbing kids or staff and testing them. But those that have provided consent, they're in a pool, and we randomly test them on a weekly basis. And that then gives us a baseline of where we're at. And the numbers are very advantageous. I think in my communication I shared, we had a total of 8 positive cases with over 500 tests completed. 2 of those positives are potential from having been positive in the past, kind of a carryover. We made a change and removed prior positives from our surveillance pool so that we don't have that in the mix. Sure. So it's either 8 if you're thinking about every positive, and 6 if those 2 are tossed out as a result of prior positive, out of over 500. And so that's a pretty good number, and it answers a lot of questions. Number one, it tells us that there isn't a ton of asymptomatic school-age kids walking around, which is beneficial information to know as far as our community and as the state's concerned. And then, of course, we know that there's going to be some positives that come up because you can be asymptomatic and still be positive, right? Right. But we know that the incidence of that is low. And this baseline, then, this roughly 1.6% or give or take of the positivity rate will be our baseline as we move to 4 day a week. The surveillance testing will allow us to be more proactive, right? So as we're getting this data on a daily basis, we can make these determinations rather than, waiting 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or it's kind of a wait and see. And by the time something might be up in that case without doing surveillance testing, it's like, oh boy, and then you got something on your hands. Yeah. And in this case, and we don't anticipate, I want to emphasize that, if we thought that this was going to cause a massive spike in cases or significant school spread, we wouldn't be doing it. Right. And so there is all kinds of evidence, anecdotal evidence, as well as some growing evidence base that this is a fairly safe move. And frankly, based on our case rates, it's a great choice, because ultimately kids need to be in school in person as much as possible. And we're, achieving that goal.
Giving them a bit of that routine before the school year wraps up is such a key part of all of this, and important. It also there are added layers to this too that you touched on, where we're giving data to our health department, and that's important information that they wouldn't have otherwise if we're not letting kids in school. So again, not to say that this is about numbers or about data, but it doesn't hurt to have that stuff along with the fact that we're giving them a bit of routine back. When it came to making this decision, Craig, what all went into it?
Oh boy.
Yeah. So I apologize for asking an hour question 20 minutes into the interview, but yeah.
And that's no problem. I chuckle too, because, this has been so incredibly complex, and you're unfortunately operating somewhat in the blind, right? And because what you want to do is you want to make decisions based off of, common sense and rational, pragmatic thought processes, and things that average people, when you would review this, be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a sound decision based on all of these factors. So the rub is that there's just not a lot out there. And the health department from the state, and, the CDC, and of course, anybody that's been alive during this pandemic realizes that there's so many unanswered questions, and there's still a lot of things we don't know. And that's reason for apprehension, but it's also not enough reason, in my opinion, just to sit on our laurels and be like, okay, well, clearly what we're doing is okay, so let's not make a change, because it doesn't make sense. But with that said, and I don't mean to, my comment here is not to throw any organization, entity under the bus, but to say that it's complex. So you can get conflicting information. You can get CDC guidelines, and the state DHS guidelines don't match with what the CDC guidelines are. You can get local county interpretation of state and CDC guidelines. You can have commentary from our medical advisors. But I think the point is, and that's why it's a complicated and difficult process. But the point is that we were super lucky here in Wisconsin Rapids to have our director of our health department, Sue Comferman, and our two medical advisors, Dr. Falk and Dr. Olson, who have kids in the district, involved and engaged in all being very thoughtful and rational and flexible with what we're doing, how we're doing it, and where we need to get to. And that's frankly what is allowing us to arrive here, despite what's going on at the state level and the national level with the CDC and all of those things, right? And so I chuckle, because when you talk about this with people, you would think that school districts in particular, right, because of our role and that we're responsible for significant numbers of students and, very involved in the community and so forth, that there would be like, nope, here's what you do, right? And here's the guidelines. So it's pretty simple. And it's just not been that. Yeah. But I understand why. And that is because people really don't know. You know what I mean? And sometimes things change a little slower than necessary out of an abundance of precaution. But we've at least retained the ability to behave in a somewhat independent fashion on a local level and make decisions that are best for our kids and our community. And, continue to try to move forward. And again, use common sense to the best of our ability.
Yes. I know that there is a referendum coming up, and this is a big one. There's a lot of working pieces to this and everything. So I wanted to just kind of take some time with it. Where would you like to start with this? I know that there's two different questions that are going to be on this and everything. Do you want to just start right there?
Yeah, that sounds great. So there's the two questions that we're talking about. One is called a levy override, or also you'll hear it referred to as an operational referendum. And so we'll start there. The question that voters will see is it's a $2 million a year for 5-year levy override or operational referenda question. And what that allows us to do is continue to improve and enhance curriculum and technology. Excuse me. And so that is kind of an all-encompassing statement. And in running some of our numbers and in doing community presentations and having conversations with groups, some of these details are ferreted out and become quite clear. But in a general sense, we have like about $17+ million of technology to replace over long term, and we're spending on average between 250 to 500,000 a year on curriculum updates. And as I indicated in my presentations, those two numbers don't correlate. So you just said 2 million a year for 5 years, which equals 10, but you said we have like 17 million in technology purchases as well as curriculum purchases to make. And that is because levy override dollars or operational dollars are just part of our general fund. And we're, of course, still going to use general fund for things like computer purchases, but the additional dollars will help us offset that cost and continue down the trajectory that we're on, which is to stay as current as possible and as updated as possible with things like classroom technology, computers for student use, iPads for student use at lower elementary level, classroom-based technology. So smart boards are no longer supported, like the software is not being updated any longer. So now they're kind of like a glorified, projector.
Yeah.
Shifting over to interactive, touch-sensitive screens or monitors. It kind of looks like a giant flat screen, but it's actually touch-sensitive and interactive.
Pretty cool.
So classroom technology. And then, of course, the curriculum piece, which is what people would think about for those that have been out of school for a while. That's textbooks, workbooks, and materials along those lines. But it's also supplemental software that is now integrated into and part of the curriculum, because it's really almost impossible to just say, here's curriculum and here's technology, and they're two separate things, right? Yeah. So that is, in general, what the $2 million levy override would cover, and would position us to continue down the trajectory of ensuring that those things are updated and, we continue to improve programming.
It's important. It's so vital that this first question is that people read this through and do their homework on this, because this is not only these numbers are key not only to making sure that our youth are prepared going forward with their next steps as they get continue their education and everything, but it is about our future. It is about not just their future, but all of our future. I feel like I'm giving a spoiler alert all the time here. That's something we all know. They're going to be running things. It would be in our best interest to make sure that they are as well equipped to do that as possible. That is what this is an investment in. I know that for some people that don't have kids in school anymore, or certain things maybe don't even have kids, these topics can get kind of like, well, what does this have to do with me? It absolutely affects you. It affects every single one of us. So it's important to look this through and think this through when you're answering on these and going into this.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's absolutely broader ramifications around particularly the educational system and what we're engaged in, and the importance of that long term, far after kids graduate from high school, of course.
The second question then, where does that take us?
The second question is a different question. It's called a bond issue or a debt issue question. And that is basically like taking a mortgage or allowing us to borrow a certain dollar amount. And the dollar amount that we've arrived at is $34 million. And I'll explain specifically why we arrived at that number in just a second. But in a general sense, that encapsulates several different projects that we hope to accomplish. I also want to get into why it's all balled into one question, because back in the old days, you might see 3, 4, 5, or even 6 debt issue questions all separated out on a ballot. We can no longer do that under state statute. We can only ask a maximum of 2 questions. And you have to separate levy override questions from bond issue questions. So that's why there's 2, and that's also why there's only 2.
That latter part I didn't know. I'm glad you brought up the first part, because I don't think that's common knowledge, and we want more and more people to know that. But that second part, I didn't even know that part. That's interesting.
Exactly, because common sense, going back to that theme,
right,
would tell you that if you have a multi-project bond issue, why not ask voters, hey, if we do this, secured entrances, for example, and it's going to cost us $12 million, do you say yes or no to that? If we renovate Lincoln High School science classrooms, it's going to cost us whatever the number is, 17. Don't quote me on that, but in that ballpark. Should we do that? And then they answer yes or no to each of those parts. We can't do that any longer under statute. You could break it up. I mean, we could have 2 bond issue questions that are separate, but if we're asking another levy override question, which we have to ask for operational purposes, we're now isolated to only asking the one, right, for the bond issue. So that's a little bit different. And so in total, I kind of reviewed a couple of pieces of that. So an aspect, once again, is secured entrances on the schools. In a general sense, that simply diverts any visitor, parent, or whatever to a school building when we're in operation to the office. And they right now have to, ring a buzzer and you come up on a video screen to be let in. But in many of our buildings, then you have to traverse a hall or you have to go through an open area before you head into the office. So in some buildings, this is pretty easy implementation of like switching around doors and adding a door and maybe changing the breezeway or, whatever the case is, so that when you come in, the only door that you have access to would be the door to get into the office to check in. And in other buildings, we have to relocate the office. And in my presentations, I go through each building by building and what the estimated dollar amount is around that modification. So clearly in some where you have to relocate and construct a new office, it's slightly higher. And in others, it's, still a sizable dollar amount, but you're talking 100 and some thousand to 200,000 versus, $1 million as an example. So that would, if it passes, would transpire at each school. Another portion that I alluded to earlier is renovations at Lincoln High School. For those that have been in town for a long time, they know that Lincoln High School is considered the new Lincoln High School because it is not the old Lincoln High School, which was built in 31. New Lincoln High School was constructed in 1979, finished in 79. And so the science classrooms up on the second floor are still circa 79. And it's 2021. And so we're, about 40 plus years past that, which is about time that we start to evaluate whether or not those facilities can maintain and accommodate the level of instruction, particularly for something like science, right?
Well, I was just going to say, of all the departments that can't be, but like, then it's science, that's a main one definitely.
Absolutely. So that encapsulates some modifications on that second floor. The primary approach is to modify the science classrooms, but in doing that, that also takes up some of this existing space of our current media center. So that would also allow the media center to be relocated, the library to be relocated on the front of the building in conjunction with creating the secured entrance at Lincoln High School. And also a more of a student resource center vibe spilling into the commons. So a much more collaborative sort of open space kind of think college student center feel versus right. And it also would be a much more flexible space for community use, meetings and other things that transpire, because the media center library would be kind of attached and contiguous where our existing commons is, and one would kind of spill into the other. So in a general sense, that's what's all encapsulated at Lincoln High School. And then we also have the addition of a gym at Think Academy or Rudolph Elementary. And that is almost entirely due to the fact that they do not have a full-size gym out there. So on the front end, it is in some cases a fairly standard elementary space, but it's also used as the cafeteria. So it's the gym to cafetorium, right? So it's the general meeting space for groups of kids. If it's more than a classroom or two, it's an area for Phi-Ed, and then it's also the cafeteria. So clearly, as you described that, there's some limitations that poses. Although it's functional, I mean, clearly we can conduct school out there. We have been. It's functional, but the addition of a gym space out there would not only benefit the students in our programming at Think Academy, but also, in a broader sense, the community in that area and in Wisconsin Rapids as yet another space for community use.
That area, those kids, they deserve that, and it would stop the whole when having dodgeball break out during lunch and everything. You don't need that.
No.
Those two can't be put together. But no, in all seriousness, those kids deserve that. And there are so many aspects of both of these questions that are vital and important. When we're getting to that second question, right away, the first thing that stands out to me is something that'll keep our kids safer. I feel like that when that one of the things that so many things happen with this pandemic that we all are that frustrate us. One of the things that frustrated me so much was I felt like as a country we were starting to get more and more closer to focusing on why are so many things happening to our kids? Why are our kids not safer in schools? And then the pandemic happens and it feels like that kind of got thrown out the window for obvious reasons. But we need to bring that back to people's forefronts. We need to get that back in the front of people's minds. This was a huge issue and a huge issue in this country. And anything that we can do to keep our kids safer, we need to be addressing that. We need to, money be damned. We need to be thinking about that and focusing on that. So that is an important part of this second question to me.
Absolutely. And we've, I mentioned on the last time I was on air, but it's a good time to mention it now. There's been safety measures the district has implemented, more enhanced safety measures over the last handful of years. much of it funded via the Department of Justice Office of School Safety grant program that we took advantage of. So that includes, enhanced video surveillance. Again, this keyless fob access, and then the video, doorbell approach, some shatterproof and bullet-resistant coating on windows and so forth in vulnerable areas. We modified some fences and access points on the grounds of some of our buildings. And so it really is kind of the next, I'm not going to say the final step, because that's an aspect we're always evaluating and looking at implementation of, anything you can do to make the building safe, but still inviting in a place that kids want to be, is absolutely the route we want to go.
We will get to, there's a referendum session coming up for people. I'll tell them about that in a moment. But in the last couple of minutes we have here, is there anything else about these questions or about this topic that you want to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the questions taxpayers have is what happens to my taxes if we do this? And I'll emphasize that the only portion of the mill rate or your property tax bill that we have control over is the school portion. So in all of our communications, we're talking about the school portion of the property tax levy. And I think, as you think about that, that simply means that, look, your local municipality can levy taxes on your property, as well as the Mid-State Technical College here locally, and a few other things. And they set their own levies and do their own thing, which may increase your taxes, which we, of course, don't have control over. But in all of the calculations that we've run, if both of these would pass, the $2 million levy override and the $34 million bond issue, there would be no impact to taxes, school portion of property taxes. And the reason behind that has to do with defeasance of existing debt that the district has paid down at a cost savings to taxpayers in terms of interest that we don't need to pay, as well as, timing, financially speaking. And so encumbering a bit of debt, the way Wisconsin school finance system works, encumbering a bit of debt in a district like Wisconsin Rapids is actually somewhat beneficial. It's not one-to-one, right? So if we didn't have the debt, it's not like the mill rate would drop proportionally to what you don't have for the debt, because your debt payments are attributable to your per pupil spending. And your per pupil spending dictates the amount of state aid you get. The amount of state aid you get offsets the local levy, right? And it's all taxes. I understand that. But I would rather have statewide taxes offsetting our costs than local property taxes offsetting the cost if we have a sliding scale to choose from. Yeah. And so a bit of debt and having debt payments actually has an effect of better maximizing our allocation of state aid as a result of what it does to per pupil spending. But that said, all of the projections we've done illustrate a mill rate that is equivalent to what we have now. I'm always going to throw the caveat out there, because zero people that I'm aware of can predict the future much further than a year or two past. And stranger things have happened in Wisconsin state history. But even running catastrophic numbers for the district, and I mean catastrophic, like property value decrease of 2 or 3%, which is not anticipated to occur, $1 million reduction in state aid, and then we see our levy, if these both pass, rising to 10-ish. Historically, that's well within the range that we've been in, slightly higher than the 9.73 we're projecting, but nonetheless not significant to the degree of people even noticing much of a difference. And again, that would be catastrophic. And I that's not a likely scenario.
No, all important to, add though to the conversation. And, you're so right about, especially with the predicting things. I'm pretty sure that Nostradamus even took 2020 off. Like even that one, he was like, I don't know. I'm not sure. You guys are on your own on that one. You can attend a referendum information session coming up this Tuesday, March 16th from 6 to 7 over at the Performing Arts Center at 1801 16th Street South. If people have other questions, Craig, or they just have other questions about other topics, how can they reach you?
Give me a call anytime, 715-424-6701. And of course, through the district website, all of my contact information is on there.
And we'll be repeating a lot of this information during Over the Back Fence as well. Always a good time talking with you, Craig. Thanks for everything you do for our community and our kids. Keep safe and strong out there, and we'll talk again real soon.
Thank you.
And a big thanks to Kevin, our friends over at Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. We appreciate you guys. Well, the More Morning Magazine coming up for you right here on AM 1320 WFHR.